Montana Territory, July 1873, the baby's cry echoed across the hay-sweet air, sharp and desperate, just as the sun cracked over the ridge behind the McAllister ranch. Xavier McAllister paused mid-step, the barn door swinging open in his hand. He had not expected company in his barn before breakfast, let alone a crying woman and an infant. She was huddled in the far corner, half-shadowed, sitting on a folded saddle blanket like she had been there a while. Her dress was dusty, the hem torn. She held the baby tight to her chest, rocking gently, her shoulders shaking. Xavier stepped inside, letting the door fall shut behind him. The morning chill clung to the air, stirring the dust around his boots. "You lost?" he asked, voice low but steady. The woman flinched like he had struck her, then turned her face. Her eyes were red-rimmed, the kind of tired that went deeper than sleep. The baby, wrapped in a thin blanket, let out another high cry, and she pressed her cheek to its head. "My name's Xavier McAllister," he said, not moving closer. "This is my land. You're welcome to stay, but if you need food or help, I do not want trouble," she said quickly, her voice hoarse. "I just needed somewhere out of the wind. You found it." She blinked at him, surprised by the lack of suspicion in his tone. Xavier took off his hat, running a hand through his dark, wind-tossed hair. "You got a name," she hesitated. "Nola Merritt," he nodded once. "And the little one, his name's River," she said softly, adjusting the blanket around the baby's face. "He's 8 weeks. Xavier's jaw tightened at that. He had seen too many women with babies and nowhere to go since the war ended, some left behind, some running from something worse. "You hungry?" he asked. Nola looked down, guilt flickering across her face. "I can make coffee and eggs," he said. "Stay until you're ready to leave." His eyes held hers for a long moment, or do not. She stared at him, lips parted, like she did not quite understand what he was offering, or maybe she did not believe it. "I do not have anywhere else," she whispered. "Then you are not going anywhere." He turned and walked out without asking any more questions. Nola sat stiff at the table, River in her arms. The kitchen of the main house was warm and simple, wood walls, stone hearth, a long pine table with mismatched chairs. The smell of coffee and frying eggs filled the air. She had not sat at a table like this in months. Xavier worked at the stove, sleeves rolled up, quiet and focused. He moved like the kind of man who had lived by himself a long time. There was a gentleness to him, though, not soft but careful. "Where's his father?" he asked in a plain voice, not turning. Nola's fingers tightened around River. "Died before he was born, shot during a robbery in Wichita." Xavier glanced over his shoulder. "I am sorry," she nodded, throat tight. "We were supposed to go west together." "Start over." He set a plate of eggs and toast in front of her, then poured coffee into a tin cup. "You still can." Her eyes lifted to his, unsure. "I ain't saying you have to, just, it ain't over yet." She looked down, blinking fast. River stirred in her arms and let out a soft whimper. Nola bounced him gently, kissing his downy head. "He has been crying a lot lately. I think he is teething." Xavier nodded. "There is a rocking chair in the front room if that helps." She looked at him again, really looked this time. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face weathered from sun and wind, but not hard. His eyes were a deep gray, steady and kind. "Why are you being so decent to me?" she asked quietly. He shrugged. "You needed help, and I had a barn." Over the next few days, Nola stayed. Xavier did not press her. He brought her more blankets, found a soft basket for River to sleep in. He fixed the broken latch on the barn door. She started helping with small chores, feeding the chickens, washing clothes by the creek, hanging them in the breeze. River calmed. His cries softened with the rhythm of quiet safety. One afternoon, Nola stood at the clothesline, hair pinned up, sleeves rolled. The wind tugged at her skirt. Xavier walked up from the field with a shovel over his shoulder. "You work like you have been here years," he said, watching her clip a shirt to the line. "Feels like I have," she said, then smiled for the first time. It caught him off guard. He walked a little closer. "You do not have to do everything." "I want to," she said. "I am not used to sitting still." She looked over at River, sleeping in a basket on the porch. "He deserves a place where the wind does not feel so sharp, where I do not have to run." Xavier followed her gaze, then looked back at her. "You are safe here," she swallowed. I keep trying to believe that, you will, he said. Their eyes met, and she felt something shift deep in her ribs. That night, River woke crying. Nola stepped out onto the front porch to soothe him, walking slow under the full moon. She did not hear Xavier until he spoke. Sometimes the quiet is the hardest part. She turned. He stood near the railing, arms folded, looking out at the hills. I thought I wanted peace, she said, but now that I have it, it scares me, he nodded. I know the feeling. She rocked River gently, and after a moment, Xavier stepped closer. May I? He asked. She hesitated, then nodded. He took the baby gently, like he had held children before. River blinked up at him, then stilled. You are good with him, she said softly. I had a younger brother, raised him after our folks died. He was just about River's size back then. What happened to him? Joined the army, never came back. Nola reached out, touching his arm. I am sorry. He looked down at her hand, then back into her eyes. You do not have to be, you are here now. She did not let go, he did not move, and for the first time in a long time, Nola Merritt felt something like hope, not because everything was fixed, but because this man, this quiet, steady man, had found her crying in his barn with a baby, and instead of turning her away, he said, stay until you're ready to leave, or do not. And somehow she wanted to stay. By the second week, Nola had moved into the spare room in the main house. Xavier hadn't suggested it outright, he'd simply cleared it out, set clean sheets on the bed, and left the door open. She'd taken the invitation without words, carrying River in her arms, her eyes scanning the room like she still couldn't quite believe it was real. She hadn't said thank you. She hadn't needed to. Late one morning, while sunlight filtered through the lace-trimmed curtains and River napped in a woven cradle near the hearth, Nola stood at the corner of the pasture, watching Xavier mend a section of fence. She held a pail of water in one hand, the hem of her dress damp with dew. The horses grazed just beyond him, tails flicking in the heat. You always work alone? She asked as he straightened, wiping his brow with the back of his wrist. Mostly, he said. Had a hand last year, but he left for Fort Benton come spring. She nodded, stepping over the split rail to hand him the pail. You ever think about hiring again? I'd need someone who doesn't mind quiet or dust or not getting paid much. She smiled faintly. I think you just described me. His hand brushed hers as he took the pail. You planning to stay that long? I don't know, she said, glancing toward the house, but I don't feel like I'm running anymore. Xavier didn't answer right away. He knelt to hammer a nail back into place, the muscles in his forearm flexing with the motion. After a while, he said, I cleared out the old garden patch yesterday. There's still time to get beans in the ground. I haven't grown anything since I was a girl, she said, surprised. Still remember how? Her eyes lingered on the turned earth beyond the chicken coop. I think I'd like to try. That afternoon, they worked side by side in the sun-warmed soil. Xavier showed her how to measure the rows using twine and stake. She dug with her sleeves pushed past her elbows, her hands raw but steady. River lay on a quilt nearby, shaded by a makeshift lean-to of canvas and fence posts, gurgling now and then when the breeze caught his face. As they worked, Nola asked, You ever think of leaving Montana? Used to, he said, pressing seeds into the dirt. But it's quiet here and I've got no one waiting elsewhere. She glanced over. You ever been married? No, he didn't elaborate and she didn't press. Instead, she said, I did once. Xavier's hands stilled, then resumed his careful movements. You loved him? I thought I did, she said, her voice dry. But he made promises he didn't keep. We were already halfway here when I found out about the debts. He left one night, said he'd come back with enough to get us through the winter. He didn't. She looked down at her dirt-caked hands, then brushed them on her skirt. I made it 2 weeks before I sold my wedding ring for train fare. Xavier didn't look at her, but his voice was quiet when he said, You did what you had to. She nodded, swallowing thickly. As dusk stretched across the hills, they packed up the tools and folded the quilt. River fussed softly, rubbing his fists over his eyes. Xavier lifted him without hesitation, cradling the baby against his shoulder as they walked back toward the house. Feels heavier than before, he said. He's growing, Nola said, her voice gentler now. He's starting to reach for things, too. I think he's going to be strong. At the porch, Xavier handed River back, but not before the baby latched onto his shirt collar with a surprisingly firm grip. "He's already stubborn," Xavier said, raising an eyebrow. Nola laughed quietly, but with warmth that hadn't been there before. "Takes after me." Later, she sat in the rocker near the hearth, River asleep in her arms. The room glowed with lamplight and the faint scent of pine smoke. Xavier sat at the table, sharpening a knife with slow, even strokes. Nola spoke without looking up. "If I were to stay longer than just a little while, would that be all right?" His hand paused over the whetstone. "You don't owe me anything." "I know," she said, "but I'd like to earn my keep." He set the knife down and looked at her fully. "You already have." She held his gaze, then looked away, brushing River's hair with her fingers. "I used to pray for a place like this," she said, almost to herself. "Somewhere quiet, a bit of land, someone who didn't ask too much of me." Xavier didn't respond with words. He stood, crossed the room, and gently adjusted the blanket over River's legs. His hand lingered near hers, not quite touching. "You can plant beans in the morning," he said, "and we'll see about getting you a proper garden hoe." She looked up at him, something unspoken passing between them. "All right," she whispered. And for the first time since she'd stepped off that train in Kansas, she didn't feel like she had to keep her bag packed. The cottonwoods along the creek behind the house turned gold as August settled in, their leaves catching morning light like coins in a stream. Nola stood in the shallows with her skirts tied above her knees, rinsing diapers on a flat stone. The water ran cold over her ankles, but she welcomed it. The days had grown hotter, and the house kept warmth longer than before. River lay under a patch of shade, cooing at the sway of leaves above him. Xavier rode back from the south pasture just after midday, his horse slick with sweat, saddle creaking as he dismounted. He tied the reins to a fence rail and walked toward the creek, squinting against the sun. "There's a stray calf down near the ravine," he said as he approached. "Looks like it slipped the fence line earlier." "Is it hurt?" Nola asked, wringing out a square of cloth. "Not that I saw, just wandered off." She set the damp fabric in the basket and stood, brushing her hands on her apron. "You want help finding it?" He raised an eyebrow. "You offering to chase cattle?" "I've chased worse," she said, and he gave a short laugh. By late afternoon, they were riding side by side along the ridge, River tucked into a sling across Nola's chest. The sun hung low, turning the hills honey-colored. They followed a trail of hoofprints through dry grass, Xavier scanning the land while Nola held the reins steady, her borrowed mare sure-footed even on uneven ground. "There," Xavier said, pointing ahead where the calf stood near a cluster of rabbit brush, tail twitching. "Looks like it's just tired." He dismounted and approached slowly, hands low. The calf let itself be coaxed, and soon he had it roped and tethered to his saddle horn. He patted its neck, then turned to Nola. "You did all right," he said. "Riding with a baby's no small thing." She adjusted the sling, brushing River's cheek. "He's steadier on a horse than I expected. I had to ride with him once, back near Dodge, but he cried the whole time." "Not today. Maybe he knows it's different here." She looked toward the distant line of trees. "Feels different to me, too." They rode back slow, letting the calf keep pace. The wind softened as the sun dipped behind the hills. Nola didn't speak much, but she watched Xavier when he wasn't looking how he kept one hand near the reins, the other near the rope, always steady. She wondered if he'd always been like that, or if it had come from years of being alone. That evening, while River slept in the cradle, Nola stitched a tear in one of Xavier's shirts by lamplight. He stood nearby, oiling his saddle with quiet care. The room smelled of leather and pine resin. "You ever think about building something more permanent?" she asked without looking up. He paused, rag in hand. "How do you mean?" "Not just the house, I mean a life that doesn't shift every time the wind does." He set the saddle aside and moved to sit across from her. "I tried once, bought this land thinking it'd be enough. But it's hard to build anything steady when you're the only one holding it up." She tied off her thread and folded the shirt. "Maybe it's not meant to be held alone." He watched her fingers smooth the fabric. "You think about staying?" "I think about River taking his first steps where the ground won't fall out from under him," she said. "I think about not waking every time the wind hits the window, worried someone's come to take what little I've got." Xavier leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "You wouldn't have to worry about that here." "I know," she said, meeting his eyes. They sat like that for a long while, the lamplight soft between them, the fire snapping low in the hearth. Neither reached across the space, but something passed between them, all the same, a quiet understanding, unspoken but deeply felt. Later that night, a storm rolled in from the west. The wind came first, then the rain, heavy and straight. Nola woke to River's whimper and rose to soothe him, her bare feet cool against the floorboards. She carried him out to the main room where the fire had died to embers. Xavier was already there, pulling his boots on. "You going out?" Barn doors swinging. "I need to latch it before the wind tears it clean off." She adjusted River in her arms. "Be careful." He glanced back at her, rain spattering the window behind him. "You'll be all right. I'll tend the fire." He nodded once and stepped into the dark. By morning the storm had passed. The air smelled clean and damp, and light spilled through the windows like forgiveness. Nola stood at the stove, brow damp, hair pulled back with a ribbon she'd found tucked in her old sewing roll. River slept nearby, cheeks pink from sleep. Xavier entered, shaking rain from his coat. "Fence held," he said. "No trees down." She handed him a cup of chicory brew, still warm. He took it, then looked at her over the rim. "You sleep at all?" "Some." He kept fussing with the thunder. Xavier leaned against the counter, his voice quieter now. "You've weathered worse." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "But I'd rather weather it here." He didn't answer right away. He just reached out, slow and sure, and tucked a strand of damp hair behind her ear. She didn't pull away. Outside, the land glistened under the rising sun, every leaf and stone washed clean. The sound of the bell on the north gate carried into the kitchen just past midday, faint but unmistakable. Nola looked up from where she was cutting potatoes, her knife stilling mid-slice. Xavier, seated near the hearth with a ledger open across his knees, closed it without a word and stood. "I'll check it," he said. She dried her hands on her apron and followed him to the door. A lone rider waited by the gate, reins slack, a long trail of dust still settling behind him. His coat was worn and sun-faded, the brim of his hat pulled low over his brow. As Xavier unlatched the gate, the man nodded once in greeting. "McAllister?" the rider asked. "That's right. I came from Deer Lodge, name's Silas Darren. Your letter reached us late. We just finished driving up a dozen head from the big hole. They're stalled down near the crossing." Xavier's jaw shifted slightly. "Didn't expect them until next month. Early thaw changed the trail." "You want to inspect them? I'll be down before dusk. Tell your men to keep 'em watered." Silas tipped his hat and turned his horse, heading back the way he came. Xavier watched him disappear into the heat shimmer, then turned back toward the house. Nola waited just inside the door, River settled on her hip. "You expecting cattle?" she asked. "Bought them in spring. Figured it was time to grow the herd again." He stepped past her to retrieve his rifle from the wall hook. "They'll need counting and tagging." "I'll ride out soon." She shifted River to her other arm. "You want me to pack a basket?" His eyes flicked to hers. "If you've got a mind to." She did. While he gathered tools and saddled his horse, she filled a cloth sack with bread, dried venison, and a jar of pickled beans. River dozed in the shade outside, one hand curled against his cheek. As Xavier tied the sack to his saddle, she stepped down from the porch. "You'll be back before dark, if all goes clean," he said. "But if not, I'll bed down there." She nodded, then after a breath asked, "You need someone to ride out with you?" He paused, one hand on the saddle horn. "You offering?" "I'm not afraid of a trail ride. You'd have to stay the night, it's a good stretch out." She looked toward River. "He slept through longer." Xavier studied her a moment, then said, "All right, if you're sure." They left that afternoon, with River bundled against her chest again and the sun dropping lower behind them. The trail to the crossing was dry, lined with thistle and sage, the air thick with late summer heat. They didn't speak much, the quiet comfortable, filled only with the rhythm of hooves and the creak of saddle leather. By the time they reached the river bend, the cattle were lowing in a rough corral beside a canvas tent. A pair of trail hands stood nearby, their faces flushed from sun and work. Silas waved them over, gesturing to the herd. 11 head, sound and whole. One's got a cracked hoof, but she's bearing weight. Xavier dismounted and moved to inspect the animals without a word. Nola remained on her horse, River stirring lightly in his sleep. "You brought a woman with you?" one of the hands asked, surprised. "She's not just company," Xavier said, brushing his hand along the flank of a young steer. "She's part of the ranch now." The man raised his brows but said nothing more. Later, after the cattle were settled and the men had returned to their fire, Xavier led Nola to a flat patch of earth near a stand of cottonwoods. He spread out bedrolls and laid River between them, cushioned by folded blankets. The moon rose slow and full, casting pale light across the riverbank. Crickets sang in the tall grass. Nola lay on her side, watching River's chest rise and fall. "You've had this land a long time," she said softly. 7 years. "You ever think of selling it?" He turned his head toward her. "Why would I?" Some men do when they've been alone too long. They stop thinking it can be more than what it is. "I used to think that," Xavier said after a moment, "but not since you showed up in my barn." She smiled, small but sure. "I didn't mean to stay, I know, but I want to now." He reached across the blanket and touched her hand lightly, his fingers warm. "Then stay." She closed her eyes, his thumb brushing the back of her knuckles. "I never thought I'd have a second chance," she whispered. "Not with someone who sees me and doesn't flinch." "I see you," he said, "and I want you here." She didn't answer with words, just moved her hand to rest against his chest, palm over his heartbeat. And there, under the cottonwoods and the wide Montana sky, with River breathing steady between them, Nola stopped wondering when she'd leave, because she wasn't going to. By early September, the days lost their heavy heat. The wind carried the first hints of frost, and the sky wore a deeper blue, like it was bracing for snow. The cattle settled well into the new pasture, and River had begun to sit up on his own, blinking up at the world with wide, curious eyes. Nola stood by the new feed shed, her skirt catching in the breeze. She was measuring oats into a canvas sack when Xavier returned from town with a wagon load of supplies. She hadn't expected him back until the next day, and the sight of him carefully guiding the team down the slope brought a quiet lift to her chest. She stepped aside as he drew near, noting the barrel of flour, fresh nails, and a bolt of plain muslin tied to the back with a strip of red calico. "You didn't need to rush back," she said as he dismounted. "I didn't like the thought of you here alone overnight," he replied, tying off the reins. Besides, the mercantile had everything ready sooner than they said. Her eyes flicked to the calico. "That for me," he nodded. "Figured you might want something for yourself." She ran a thumb along the edge of the fabric. "It's too fine for everyday." "Doesn't have to be everyday." She looked up at him, eyes warmer than the sun overhead. "Thank you." He adjusted his gloves, almost sheepish. "You're welcome." That evening, after River had gone down and the wind rose against the windows, they sat by the hearth again, though this time Nola brought out a carved box from the bottom of her trunk. Inside were letters, scraps of ribbon, a rosary with a broken chain, and a faded daguerreotype of her younger sister, long past. She hadn't opened it since Kansas. Xavier didn't ask why she showed him. He only waited. "I used to think if I kept all of this," she said, running her fingers over the rosary, "then I'd remember who I was before." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. "And do you?" She shook her head. "I don't think I need to anymore." He reached out slowly and folded the lid closed with her hand still resting on it. "You're not who you were before, neither am I." She met his eyes. "I want to build something with you," he said, voice steady. "Something that lasts." Nola didn't answer right away. She looked toward the cradle where River's breathing rose and fell softly beneath folded quilts, then back to Xavier. "Then let's build it." They married before the first snow. Reverend Harlan came up from the valley, and the neighbors from 3 ranches out rode in, bringing jars of apple preserves and hand-carved toys for River. Nola wore a dress made from the red calico, hemmed with the muslin. Her hair was braided with a sprig of sage tucked behind her ear. Xavier wore his best shirt, collar starched, boots polished. The ceremony was short, held beneath the cottonwoods that had shaded them that night by the river. River fussed once during the vows, then quieted when Xavier took him in his arms, cradling him between them as they stood together. The wind stirred the leaves and the sun spilled gold over the hills. After they shared coffee and honey bread around the fire pit, laughter rising into the early dusk. Someone brought out a fiddle, and Nola spun slow in Xavier's arms, her cheek resting against his chest. Later that night, when the guests had gone and the moon rose high, they stood on the porch, listening to the coyotes call out from the far hills. "You ever think we'd end up here?" she asked, her voice low against his shoulder. "No," he said, holding her close. "But now I can't imagine anywhere else." She tightened her arms around him. "We're not just surviving anymore." "No," he said. "We're home." They stayed out until the stars burned sharp above them, River sleeping soundly just inside, safe in the cradle Xavier had carved new rails for with his own hands. The first snow came 2 weeks later. Nola watched it fall from the kitchen window, flour dusting her forearms as she kneaded dough. Xavier came in from the barn, cheeks pink from cold, and wrapped his arms around her from behind, chin resting on her shoulder. "I could live 100 winters like this," he murmured. She smiled, leaning into him. "Then let's live them," and they did. Through each season, each year, side by side, River grew strong, his first steps taken in the lean shadow of the barn, his first words spoken at the edge of the garden rows they planted together. Nola taught him songs her mother once hummed over washboards and warm bread. Xavier taught him how to ride, how to mend a fence, how to listen to the land. They added a second room to the house, then a third. The garden stretched longer each spring. They marked the passing years not by hardship, but by growth, by the trees they planted, the harvests they put up, the quiet joy of evenings spent in one another's company. And in all that time, not once did Nola feel the need to pack her bag again, because the running was done. And the love they built, quiet, steady, deeply earned, never left them.